Hi. Okay, so my name is Kim Kan Tae Wing. Thank you, Olio, for having me. Thank you, Strand. This is one of the coolest bookstores in the world. And I'm going to try not to sound like Peter Brady at any point during this talk because I'm terrified right now. Do you want me to go louder? Oh, I just have to I have to get up on it. Okay. Hey. So actually, I will tell you quickly what I did do the other night. We started a series called Revealing Roots. And I do research with refugee women, and I've just been thinking about ways to sort of tell immigrant stories and also have a space for artists. A lot of musicians and artists come together, play, hang out, and all the proceeds go to an organization that is either a local grassroots organization based in New York or beyond. And so that's what we're doing. We'll have it once every month or so different musicians and artists get together and a different organization each month to support. Cool. So if you're interested, check out Revealing Roots. Okay, so I'm going to launch right into it. So the talk is about sexual pleasure and intimacy in the time of capitalism. But I kind of want to clear some things up. So what the talk is actually not going to be about and what the talk will be about. So it will not be about sexual positions and tips, which would be amazing, but not this talk. But it is going to be about how we connect with one another and how those connections shape sexual pleasure and social relations. And so basically, after many failed relationships, I became just genuinely curious about intimacy and how does this thing work? And so, I'd been asking a lot of questions about intimacy and pleasure, and I do research in gender and sexuality. But I had been asking questions about relationships, intimacy, and love, and they all kind of exist in this one area. And I kind of realized that there are a lot of other forces in our world that shape how those interactions even go. And so we'll sort of explore what I'm talking about. But I realized that I basically had to expand the questions that I was asking, and I had to expand the lens that I was using because I live in psychology. And we love to narrow shit down. We come to like one or two factors. We are like pretend that other things aren't happening, and we control for other things. And look, there's a link here, which is very helpful, but it often obscures all of these other factors that are related to the thing that you are genuinely curious about. And so as I was sort of, reading a lot of literature in gender, sexuality, I also do work in trauma. I found a theory that really basically helped me to take a breath. And I'll talk a little bit about that theory in the lecture, but it's called dynamic systems theory. Have you heard of that already? Okay, cool. Yes, for those who have not and also those who have. But it's basically a theory that allowed me to say, to hold space for a lot of factors going on at the same time. So again, in psychology, we're really interested in narrowing, your experience down to a couple of things that we can identify and measure and relate together and show that there's a relationship. But DST, at that time I was saying, but all of these other factors influence what's going on. And so dynamic systems theory, or DST, allowed me to hold space for all of those factors that shape what's happening. And all it is that, you don't have to go so deep into each factor, but you can acknowledge that it's there instead of pretending that it's not. And so it basically also allowed us, or me, to realize that we are influenced. So I'm interested in this particular case, relationships, pleasure, intimacy, but to also acknowledge that though, what I'm interested in is influenced by political factors as well as economic factors. And those factors are embedded in a very particular history. And so right now, we are all living in a very particular historical moment in which there have been and are many different possibilities. And so it's no small thing. So it's a small thing that gives me hope for the future, because otherwise, the world that we're living in would seem inevitable. And anyway, so we're living in currently a particular economic and political system, which is capitalist. And I'm going to break that down because I often find sometimes we like throw these words around and people don't really have a solid idea of what that really means. And then how do the values and practices within that particular system impact our relationships? Cool? Okay. Okay. So, I have to do that. So this is just a little plug. I also started sexgenlab.org with a lot of colleagues of mine and our professor. But we are a bunch of scholars that are taking academic research in gender and sexuality and making it more accessible for folks who are not in the academy. And so, this is sort of one of the ways that I enter the conversation about sexuality and pleasure. And I also enter it as a cis, Asian, heterosexual woman, right? And so that also gives me a very particular insight and a very particular entrance into that conversation. So as I was learning more about, through research and study about gender development, sexual fluidity, sexuality, the more excited I am for the moment in time in which we live. We are living in a time now where conversations about what is possible for what it means to be a girl and a woman in this world is much more expansive. Also, what is possible for boys and men in this world right now is much more expansive than it was before. And so it's a time where we're starting to realize that there are binaries that aren't really real, right? And then even more exciting that there's so much more than the gender binary as well as sexualities. And it just means that there's the possibility for us to just be human at some point, right? To explore what resonates with us and what feels good and go from there. And so there's a lot more possibility right now for different sexualities. And I have often thought to myself, if I grew up now, right, in a time when radical conversations about gender and sexuality were in the mainstream as they are now, I would have felt much safer as a younger person to just explore and check it out, right? So what an exciting time to develop as an adolescent. Or now. Okay, so what does the science say about what it means to be human, what's fulfilling about our human existence? So I don't know if you've heard of this, but Harvard has conducted one of the longest studies. Yeah? The happiness study? Yeah. It wasn't supposed to be a happiness study. But it was a study about adult life. And their basic major finding was that we need each other. So Harvard researchers followed about 700 white male students in the class of 1938 and followed them for, at this point, over 80 years, and then eventually their wives and their children. And so they had tons of data. They basically met with them in interviews, did brain scans, did blood work, and asked them about their emotional and psychological lives, their work life, their home life, their relationships. And, so one of the executive directors for the project essentially said, after 80 plus years of study and millions of research money, for anybody that does research, that's millions and millions at Harvard, they came to a major conclusion that was that happiness is love, full stop. And so they found that essentially social connections appear to really, really good for our health. People who had happy, healthy relationships tended to live longer and have happier, healthier lives. And so they also found, so if you were someone, for example, who drank and smoked and partied, but you had a really good, solid relationships, those people ended up living longer than those who did not drink, did not smoke, and did not party, but had really bad relationships. So basically, everyone just needs to go get a cocktail and party, find yourself a good relationship, figure that out. And they also found that loneliness appears to be really toxic for you. So people who were isolated showed an earlier decline in mental functioning. Their memory loss happened earlier. And those who had good relationships appeared to have better mental functioning. So they were able to remember things, or they stayed more mentally sharp over a number of years. Bless you. So there is a wealth of research. I know, That baby is cute. I did that on purpose. That was not. So there is a wealth of research out there from various fields, everything from psychology, anthropology, primatology, neuroscience. And there's a lot of evidence right now that points to the fact that humans need social connection and how humans are literally hardwired for that. And so humans really literally are born to connect. Babies are drawn to stare at faces. They communicate with one another. They share laughs before they're even able to verbally communicate. Has anyone ever seen babies talk to each other? Like a bunch of drunk people that make no sense, but everyone is hilarious. And I always think to myself, like, I want to be in that too. So they do that naturally. They naturally relate to one another. So being in relationships, so not only romantic, and that's another thing we need to address, right? In this society, we really privilege romantic relationships as the place where you get your intimacy, but that's not necessarily the case. You can have intimacy in a lot of different relationships, but having good relationships is overall just good for us. Ooh. There we go. Aw. Okay, so love and connection is happiness, but love requires some level of intimacy, and intimacy requires some level of emotional skills. And emotional skills, communication skills are often not necessarily taught. There's lots of room for us to learn how to love each other in really healthy, constructive ways. Have you been in a bad relationship? Y'all know what I'm talking about? Like, we did not learn how to navigate that necessarily. So, relationship experts basically say that intimacy can be characterized by these things. There's a sense of closeness, right? And that includes emotional closeness, it includes an intellectual connection, it includes social connection, also spiritual bonds. And it may or may not be sexual. Again, in this society, we really privilege sex, right? Not that it's not important, but it's not the only thing that speaks to or contributes to your sense of intimacy. And it also involves some level of taking risks and in being vulnerable with someone. There are gender differences, but we'll discuss that later on. And there's some level of self-disclosure. So expressions of vulnerability, it's important for creating intimacy, but those expressions can be reinforced, by positive interactions, and they can also be deterred. You can also learn how to run from them. Anyone run after you had a bad relationship and then you just kept on running for the next couple of relationships? Okay. That's all we had to say about that. So there are some prerequisites for intimacy. Again, there's some level of disclosure that's important, and that's important to create space to safety for vulnerability, right? And it doesn't necessarily matter whether what you're sharing is negative or positive. It's more about how you're sharing it, right? So is it constructive or is it retaliatory? Anyone been in a fight and you say things you definitely should not have? Yeah, so in the heat of the moment, you can react, right? So how are you communicating your needs? Is it done in a way that the other person will really hear you and feel like they want to respond because they're not being pushed into a defensive corner, right? There is also a big difference between infatuation and intimacy. So does someone see you as a fantasy? Are you being fetishized in that moment for what you represent because of your race, because of your gender? Or does that person see you as a unique human being with your own values and beliefs and sunshine, all of that? So I'm really balancing, being right here. So how do we develop? Let's take a step back though, right? I'm asking questions about sexual pleasure and connection and intimacy, and I feel like there's a lot of things that happen before you even get there. And so what humans need and what helps us create a fulfilling life, we know that there are barriers to having intimate relationships in adulthood. So what are some of the things that happen as we develop into who we are, and how does that impact us? I chose this. It's pretty. It's complex. It's out there, I know. But in our world, we tend to think of ourselves as this like linear being, right? You were like 8 years old and you learned some shit, and then you were like 12 years old and you learned some shit, and then you're like 25, and then like, here I am. That's literally not how it works though, right? So we need to really address how complex this process is that we're trying to figure out. That's why it's really critical for us to actually work across fields. Again, I'm in psychology and I constantly borrow from other researchers and what they're doing to figure out the thing that I'm curious about, right? Because one field is only going to give you one narrow entrance into that thing that you're curious about. So even though I live in psychology, I know that they tend to focus on individuals and individual capacities. And when we do that, again, we sort of ignore all of these other larger macro level forces that shape our individual capacities, right? So it's a lot to hold on to, and we don't really like that in psychology. We really love these factors. But again, we are unique. We are complex. We are agentic. And it's not to say that we don't, but who we are and what we do is a complex set of interactions between our biological genetic makeup and the environment that's around us. And so we are, we have our physical dimensions, our mental dimensions, our emotional dimensions, and our social. And so there's an interaction between your biological makeup and the environment in which you're developing, and our agentic choices that are shaped by those factors. And sexual pleasure and intimacy is not linear. It's not simple. It's not basic, because humans aren't. And so this rhizome was meant to sort of represent you as a person, because you're full of beautiful colors. The complexity within one person, but also the dimensions that impact sexuality and sexual pleasures for individuals within a system. I know it just got even worse. But if you can imagine this as the individual, and so you as an individual have agency, yes, but that agency, that ability to make decisions for your own life path, is contingent on your consciousness of the system in which you're embedded. So it's basically like a fish in water. So if you're a fish in water, how do you know you're wet, right? Like you've been in it all the time. So let me sort of take gender roles as a really good example. I make decisions every day about how I want to behave, what I want to say, and how I want to say, and I think, oh, I'm Kim, this is my decision. But the reality is that I've been taught how to do those things, right? What is acceptable for me to say because of who I am? The fact that I'm standing here now, right? You have particular roles that you're meant to, there are particular expectations made of us. How we should think, what we should value, how we should behave. And that's in some way based on how other people identify us. So how do other people read your gender, right? How do other people read your race? And then it's funny when people get, confused about, ooh, it's an ambiguous race. Like, what does that even mean? But gender is one of the first things that people read about us. So if I'm not aware that the expectations that are placed on me are based on false beliefs about what I'm supposed to do, I may not be aware that I'm supposed to resist against it, right? Or that I should even have a reflective moment about whether these messages that I'm given is something that resonates with me. Does it make sense? Do I even agree, right? So who you are is shaped by larger macro level systems, what the culture communicates is acceptable for you, what is ideal, what it is to be valued, and how to express that. And so you as a human being are embedded in a particular, all at once. Okay, good. So there are histories embedded into society that influence how human beings interact with themselves and how they will interact with other people. And these interactions are also play out in our sexual lives. And so it influences and shapes our approach to sexual pleasure. It influences and shapes how we relate to one another. Okay. More cute babies. Okay. So I wanted to also discuss gender development. One of the major parts of romantic sexual relationships is centered on gender. And gender development in this country is shaped by a uniquely racialized, gendered, classed ableist way. What do I mean? Can somebody talk to me about, can I get out of here? What do I mean by we are living in a place that is particularly gendered or particularly racialized? Ever heard that race is a social construct? No? Okay. Somebody's shaking their head, and I'm going to explain that. Does anybody want to answer? This is no pressure. I support you. This is a process. We all teach each other. Yes?
I've got a dumb example.
Oh, please. I have so many.
Irish people and German people used to not be white.
Yes. Exactly. Slavic people, Irish people, Italians, Jewish people, not white. Yeah, so what I mean by racialized is that race is a social construct we've been able to do. You've heard of the Human Genome Project, right? Okay, so we've mapped out DNA. So we have these particular racial groups. What are the 5 major racial groups in the US? Come on.
White, black, Asian.
Yep. Yeah. So we have these groups, right? What's the point of having groups? What are we saying? Because why do we have groups? Yeah, identity. What are we implying? There are differences between groups. So here's the thing. When you start to break down by DNA, so you right now, sitting next to the person you're sitting next to, actually share 99.9% of your genetic makeup. So between human beings, we're only differing by 0.01%. So what it is that in that construct of race, we have 5 different groups. There's an assumption that they're distinct and different. But what the DNA is telling us that there's so much variation within groups, and so that there are opportunities for you to actually share more DNA with someone in a different racial group than it is for someone else in your racial group. So you think Asia, yeah? Asia's huge. There's a lot of different Asians. I know I'm one. There's a lot. So that's what it means so racial differences, the way that we've understood them and talked about them, doesn't have a biological basis. It doesn't mean that it doesn't still operate, though, right? So it still carries importance that we still look at it. But we have to see it for what it is, something that we made up, right? Okay. So anyway, so the argument of whether nature versus nurture is really no longer helpful or constructive anymore as we're trying to figure things out. So the real question is how much of us is due to biological aspects, because they do play a role, and how much of that is due to environmental factors that do play a role. And so there's an interaction between the two, and then you get you. And in gender, what's really fascinating is that we really gender human beings from the moment they are conceived. My God, those gender reveal parties. Have you seen a baby's room? It's nuts, right? And so I can already, the gender of those babies before I have to say anything, right? And so babies absorb information at dizzying speeds. So then you're telling this human being all of these messages from day 0 about what is expected of them, right? And how they're supposed to act and behave and think. So babies from very early on, at 18 months, they have a sense of gender. They develop an awareness of themselves and as a gendered person. By age 3, they're able to connect gender with certain behaviors and clothing, so they know that women wear this, men wear this. By 5, they have a much more rigid adherence to gendered behavior. But by 7, even though they're learning more about the stereotypes of what it means to be a girl and a boy, they become more flexible. And so they say, for example, girls can cut their hair, but they're still a girl, right? Why is there a shift from age 5 to 7 in this? Why?
I mean, in language, you're learning that, it's not just that car that is a car. You're learning to, figure out what exactly, how to identify certain things as certain things.
Yeah,
and so it can be if you see somebody with long hair, it doesn't mean that they're a girl, because girls can also have short hair. They start to be able to understand.
Exactly. Because they're basically being exposed to other people that do that. So when you start seeing evidence in your world that contradicts the messages that you're told, you start to expand, right? That's what happens with learning. Okay. I don't have more time to go into the other stuff in that slide. So we are given a particular role to play in society based on our identity. So think about how you identify in your community. Anybody a sibling? Anybody an older sibling? You had a role. I was the baby. So thank you to all of the older siblings for all that you did. I appreciate that. But there are particular expectations of us and how to behave based on our particular identity. And social roles are defined by a culture's shared knowledge of what is expected of us as an individual in a specific role. And so this shared knowledge comes from social norms. And a social norm is our group's expectation, right, for what is appropriate, what's acceptable for a behavior for that member. How are they supposed to behave and how are they supposed to think? And based on those norms, we have some specific scripts that we use. So think about the way that you act at a restaurant. You all go to a restaurant, you know what to do. You go to the office, you know what to do. But what about sexual scripts? Ooh, it got interesting. Who is supposed to initiate sex? Who? Don't play coy with me. Yes. Who is supposed to play coy? Yeah. So when you say things like girls say no, but they don't really mean it, what are we communicating, right? So this is all of those very subtle ways that we communicate gender differences. Yeah? Everybody still with me? Cool. Okay. How about that photo? Right? It has no purpose. No, I'm just kidding. So here's the thing. Humans are really adaptive. That is a central feature to how humanity has been able to survive. And so all that means is that we are able to adapt. We're able to change. And given the world that we're living in, we have to. Woohoo! Dynamic systems theory. So here we are. Humans are dynamic. I found DST as a way to hold complexities all at once. And so while I still think gender is really important, it's only one part of the story of intimacy and sexual pleasure. It's only one part. So integrating a dynamic systems approach to this complex state kind of like exposes the roles and responsibilities that other factors play, and also global institutions play in creating the conditions for our interactions, right? We are living in a rapidly globalized world. So there are tons of things to balance at one time. There's lots of complexity to hold. And they are embedded within larger macro level forces that shape every aspect of our lives. And so you can think of our political, social, economic, cultural forces as elements that are linked and are in constant conversation with one another. And they create patterns over time. And as the patterns are created, they resist change, and I'll show you how. So even though we may recognize, for example, that we are living in an unjust system, do we agree that there's injustice in the world? Yes. I'm not always sure. So we're living in an unjust system, right, of sexism, racism, classism, ableism. It's extremely difficult to break free of those attractor dynamics because of how complex systems operate. Okay, so a central feature into understanding dynamic systems theory is to understand an attractor. So back to those bad relationships. They're just fun. Anybody remember a relationship where you literally fought about the same thing 15 times over? You had the same argument over and over and over, and like no matter how many times you processed it, no matter how many times you've like worked on yourself, we are stronger now, I am stronger now, you literally have one interaction that just sets you right into that same talk, right? That same fight. And so essentially the idea on the left side is that with certain dynamics, so with certain patterns, so the more that you, I have to do this both hands at step way. But the idea is that you have an interaction, right? The more that you have that interaction, the more that pattern gets created. The more more that pattern gets created, the more times it happens, the harder it is, like the deeper it goes. The deeper it goes, the harder it is to get out of it, right? So once you start that conversation, so let's say there's like 3 steps for you to get into that fight. It's like, if you were to go into one and you've done some growth, you're like, oh, let me backtrack, get out of there. You could get out of it. But what if you have like 1, 2, 3, now you're in it. Now you're in it to win it, and you're winning your argument. So again, these patterns get created, and it's really hard for us to snap out of it, right? I'm so sorry that was not recorded. I'm sure they're going to be very upset about that. I needed my full hands. So I started to see that we have an economic and political system, and that is capitalism, that has created particular attractors of particular values, particular behaviors, and beliefs that are seen as ideal, that are seen as inevitable and natural. Did you ever heard that thing, like it is what it is? Drives me nuts. It's like the laziest way out, right? And so, there's all these assumptions about, we're living in the system we're living in because it's human nature for us to be aggressive. It's human nature for us to be violent. But when we really start to break down what that means in the science, we see that that's really just not the case. So there's a lot of evidence showing that humans don't have to be violent, don't have to be aggressive, but they're in fact taught to be. And there's a lot of dynamics that reinforce that, right? Okay, so I've been drawing, am I good on time? Okay, I'm sure somebody will keep me on track. I've been drawing from a lot of critical theorists to try to understand these macro level dynamics. And critical theory basically says that oppression is created through politics, economics, culture, materialism, but it's really most effectively maintained through our consciousness. So if I don't think there's anything wrong, if I don't know that what we're living in is an unjust system, how am I supposed to even have a radar for that? And how am I supposed to resist that, right? And so we, in fact, instead have a system that where most people are easily distracted. Think Kim Kardashian. How many people follow Kim Kardashian, right? And our distractions like that allow the system that we're in to perpetuate, right? Further creating more injustices while we sort of, start to pay attention if it impacts us in some way, right? But if you're comfortable, there's no reason to start paying attention, no reason to resist, and no reason to fight any system that you don't think is unjust. And so Karl Marx thought that class was at the root of a lot of our social problems. And that the ideology of the ruling class, the most powerful in society, the wealthiest, create a particular ideological system that misleads people to act against their own best interest. So for example, voting someone in a position of power that may create policies that hurt your own community, right? And I was really inspired by Horkheimer's quote here, where he says that, theory and practice should be working to liberate human beings from the circumstances that enslave them. And so for me, it was sort of a process of learning, well, what have I been shaped by, and what messages do I think are bullshit, right? And then how do I figure that out? How do I address that? And so it was just starting with a very general question. And so this led me into looking at how capitalism works. And so let me just do like some quick breakdown. Is that okay? It'll be really boring, but you'll be all right. Now, it's a particular system, right? And so it's a very particular economic system and political system that is in which a country's trade, industry, and profits are controlled by private individuals or private companies, instead of the people who actually work in those places. So you have individuals going into a place that put in their time and blood and sweat and tears, but they don't come out with a real piece of that. Does that make sense? So they invest a lot of time and energy into a thing for someone else. So that's the main idea of capitalism, right? So the production of goods and services is based on supply and demand in the market economy rather than through central planning, which is essentially that in the market space, everything that humans need and will want will be determined in that space instead of a centralized place where they're making decisions for everyone within that system. So for example, I don't want to say things that are going to light people up. Like free education. Oh my God, it's so funny when I say this because I feel like because certain words are loaded with a lot of meaning already, right? So education is so deeply tied to money. You all just saw that, was it Morehouse? Morehouse? Billionaire that was like, this whole class, all your loans. And I was like, why couldn't I go to that class? But anyway, oh God, where was I even going with that? I just got excited. But that education is so deeply tied to economic costs. It literally could, like, you could come out with a bachelor's with like hundreds of tens of thousands of dollars of debt. And so, but what if I were to ask you about how do you monetize knowledge? If I were a human being and you were a human being and I was interacting with you and I had knowledge and I said, I'm not going to share this with you unless you pay me. Like when I break it down like that, it's such a bizarre thing, right? That I would withhold things that I know that would be beneficial for you because I can like profit off it somehow. I work in academic institutions. I'm living this life. So it's not like I'm not already in it. You know, I just wish it wasn't the case. So anyway, there are particular things that characterize a system of capitalism, right? So the mode of production is controlled by private organizations or private corporations, rather. Sorry. There's also an element of privatization. So anybody seen Gramercy Park? With its like giant gate and a key, and so like only people in that neighborhood have a key to go into this park. So it's basically if we did that to Central Park. Right? This whole idea of privatizing particular spaces that were once common, right? Also, there are basic assumptions that it holds. The idea that competition is the best way to foster innovation is an assumption about human nature. It assumes that humans are lazy, and it assumes that humans aren't going to do anything unless they're going to be paid for it, right? And there's also a lot of focus on efficiency, cost cutting, so we can maximize our profit, right? Free market meaning you have a system where there's no rules and regulations to control how you trade. But here's the thing, that assumes that both parties trading have equal power footing, right? What if I'm talking about trade between France and Taiwan? Is it a different conversation than if I were talking about something between France and Italy, right? There's also obviously profit. There's a sense of individualism, pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. Also that the rich are rich because they really worked hard, and the poor are poor because they're lazy. Anybody heard of Thomas Piketty's work though? Yay, Thomas Piketty. Okay, so he's crunched a lot of numbers and shown that about 60% of the wealth in the United States is actually inherited. So obviously also this idea of freedom. And now remember, here's the thing, language is packed with meaning. And so freedom has been this idea that's been very closely linked to capitalism, but I always question, like, are you free? Is that what freedom even means? What does freedom mean? What does liberation mean? And so the idea also is that this is the system that will create the most wealth for all. But it also creates this a transactional nature to our interactions with one another, right? And it also operates through institutions. And so this is where it gets its most power. So capitalist ideology, are you still with me? Okay. So capitalist ideology is institutionalized, right? And examples of institutions include the legal system, the education system, healthcare, even families, your government, the media, and the criminal justice system. These are all systems, right? And they're all linked together. And so they are obviously made up and devised by human beings, but they kind of operate on their own. And so even if you had a human being within the system that thought, oh, I don't want to do any oppressive stuff. The system doesn't care if an individual within that system doesn't want to do it. The system itself is already operating on its own trajectory and its own path. Does that make sense? Okay. And so injustices are actually already intricately woven into the matrix. It's already woven into the fabric of our being through institutional laws and customs and practices that we're taught to follow. So resistance right now is obviously possible. We are human beings and we are agentic. We are unique. We have the ability to, learn and be conscious and all of that stuff. But on some level, I always describe fighting gender norms as sort of like a pebble fighting back the sea. So you are one individual and you are resisting. But the thing is like the messages that you've been inundated in since you were day zero. And if you really look at the way that we internalize information and knowledge, messages are actually embedded in your very flesh. Memories are embedded in your very flesh. So yes, I don't want to be racist, but hey, let me be real about the fact that I've been taught racist messages from the time that I grew up. And then it's a process of unlearning it. And all that does is it gives me space to like not hate myself for that process and, give space for other people like on their process. So yeah. Okay, so that capitalism system basically says that this is the most effective system in creating wealth for all. I'm going to go really quickly through these because of your graphs and they're not really getting at, but I just wanted to nail that in. But this is a graph that's showing the income gap between the top 10% and the 90%. Bottom 90, that's been increasing at astronomical rates. This is also, okay, so the differences in what happened in 1980 versus what happened in 2014. So essentially in 1980, those who were at the bottom of the wealth saw a lot of income growth, right? So they saw about 3.5% of income growth every year at that year. And those at the very top saw very little income growth. Everybody with me?
Yeah.
Over time, in 2014, sorry it's not clear here, but 2014, we see the exact opposite. We see that people at the very bottom, the poorest people, have a negative growth, and people at the very top have astronomical growth, right? So basically, rich are getting richer, and that's just life. Okay. And then there's also a breakdown because race impacts this, right? So white families earning the most money above black families, Hispanic families, and non-white families. So there's obviously a racial component to this conversation. So this is the gender and racial breakdown of who is making the most money and in relation to those groups. I don't want to go through this. I feel like you kind of like intuitively know it. And if anybody is wondering, I will give you my slides. So there are essentially barriers to intimacy. And so what I was interested in is how capitalism impacts our social relationships, because I'm a psychologist and I hate economy. Does anybody else out here hate receipts? They literally, when tax comes, I'm just like, no, I like mentally, just emotionally break down. And so I hate economic stuff. I hate political stuff. I just feel like I have to pay attention in case the apocalypse happens. But the thing is like, I do care about social relationships. I do care about the human psyche. And I know that it's shaped by political and economic forces. So I can't keep my head under the rock anymore. So the question was, well, how does our economic approach with privileging profits above all else and a political system designed to secure wealth and power for the few impact our social relationships? Our relationships, though, are impacted by our sense of self. Who you brought to the table impacted that relationship. Yeah? And so our relationships are also impacted by what we value, what we think is important. For example, my personal freedom might be more important than what I see as best for the relationship, right? Or putting profits before people. Capitalism sort of transforms our intimate relationships. So the system itself is driven by principles of individualism and competition. And when you have that at the core, how does that impact how you think about yourself and other people? And then romantically, other people. Okay, so at the core of the processes, though, is this issue of power and hierarchy and control. Literally, there are like dozens of white older males voting on women's reproductive rights. So this is happening in real time So easy. Great. I have a great example to explain what I'm talking about. So these are some of the ways that oppression and domination are created, and they're all linked with one another. And they're all in conversation with one another. So white supremacy operates with capitalism, for example, to create a very specific system of hierarchy and oppression, because only particular people are at the top, right? It's not like people at the top keep rotating. That doesn't happen. And so I've been thinking about gender and reading Judith Butler's Undoing Gender. And for a long time I thought, God, do we need to get rid of this whole thing about gender to sort of understand how people operate in relationships? But then I got to realize that it's not at all about the differences. There are differences, and that's a strength. Differences in race, differences in gender, differences in sexuality, that's a good thing. That's how human beings have been able to adapt and survive this long. That's how we've been able to actually completely dominate this earth, because we're adaptive. The issue is that some people actually just are more valued, and some people hold more power than others. So that's the problem. It's not that there are differences, and it's not so bad to have femininity floating somewhere, right? I'm wearing a skirt. I love shoes. So that can't be the bad thing. No, but it's that one is in a position of power and hierarchy, and one is more important. Right? And so that's why we have these issues right now of certain people making decisions for lots of other people. There's an assumption that women can't make decisions for themselves if you're voting about their reproductive rights. That's so bizarre if you really think about it. I really equate it to if you don't have a driver's license and you're making laws for the road and you literally haven't been on it. That's an issue. Okay, so what is our sense of self? How is that impacted? So capitalism works to maintain a very particular ideal that is imposed on other people. And this creates a sense of inadequacies for those who do not fit that ideal. And so we are fed messages of that ideal body constantly, even though there are some corporations that have become savvy in their marketing to speak to the fact that we don't all fit this ideal in reality, but we still have money to spend. So speak to us, right? And so the body actually changes over time, and it changes across cultures. And I want you to start paying attention to this. Check this out. Oh, it's not dramatic if it doesn't work when I say it. Okay, so these are some changing beauty standards over time. Check out the 1920s, 30s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Everybody got a good look at that? Then what happens in the 1980s, 90s, 2000s, 2010? What do you notice?
Not much change.
Yeah. I'm sorry, clothes did change. Yeah, outfits changed. What else? What else changed? Did shape change?
Skin color.
Yes, skin color. Thank you. That's one of them. But isn't it very interesting how Kim Kardashian's features are really accentuated in a very particular way? Right? Okay, so what we notice is that women's bodies, right, we're given a particular ideal that changes over time to some extent. But how do seeing images like this that tell us what is attractive impact how we relate to ourselves and how we relate to our bodies, right? How does that impact how I feel? And so research shows that, back to sexuality and sexual pleasure, research shows that a woman's perception of her body impacts her sexual life. So women who feel more negative about their bodies report having lower levels of sexual desire, lower levels of arousal, and increased sexual avoidance. And so the more a woman perceives herself as attractive, the more desire she experiences. And orgasm is more frequently reported by women who are satisfied with their bodies and perceive themselves to be attractive. And women who were distracted with how their bodies looked during sex had more inconsistent orgasms. Right? So how we are taught to see what is beautiful how we see ourselves in relation to that impacts our interactions in sexual encounters. So it's not to say, by the way, when they do perceive of themselves as not attractive, it is not that they actually are unattractive, obviously. It's how women see themselves, right? You get the difference? Okay. But, that's not only for girls and women. There's this. Body image pressures don't only affect girls and women, right? Boys and men are shown the same images, the same pressures. So newer research actually shows that 1 in 4 boys experience eating disorders. Many feel inadequate if they're not muscular or the ideal. So basically, it all hurts everybody, and we need to stop putting unrealistic ideals out there. But I still want to see Avengers, so... Did you see it? Nobody give it away. Don't do it. Okay, so here's the thing. There are particular outcomes, yeah? So what are the outcomes related to our capitalist society that has a specific ideal way to be in the world? What does that mean for us who are not ideal? So there's a major profit to be made from people feeling inadequate in some way. Plastic surgery, so stats from 2018 show that it was the most money people had ever spent thus far on plastic surgery. And it came out to be about a $16 billion industry. There's also skin whitening creams, and that's a $20 billion a year industry. Skin whitening creams are obvious, right? I don't need to break that down. Okay, cool. So of all of those cosmetic surgeries, breast augmentations are still at the top, liposuction, nose reshaping, eyelid surgery, again, racialized, a tummy tuck. And I actually I tried to get the numbers for like the increase in butt augmentation after Kim Kardashian came out. I couldn't find it, but that's happening. So the idea is obviously that, if you buy this, right? If you spend money on this procedure, if you buy this, cream, or if you buy these particular clothes, you buy this and that, you will be more attractive and then therefore loved and then therefore valued and find someone to love you, which is obviously bullshit. You are totally worthy of love. Okay, so what we're seeing is that there is a loneliness epidemic, though, right? I know that was really sad. I'm so sorry. Wait, there, graphs. Have you heard the Cigna study? Over 20,000 people participated, and the overall national loneliness score was really alarmingly high. And the younger people, part of Generation Z. Anyone Generation Z here? I believe that's 18 to 22. Yay! Woohoo! We love you. Okay, so millennials and Generation Z were more likely to report having no sexual partners as adults compared to Gen Xers born in the 1960s and 70s. There's also research showing that Gen Zs and millennials are having the least amount of sex, the least number of partners of all the other generations. Now, I'm not saying that sex is necessarily a marker for intimacy. That you can have deep intimacy, deep connection without sex, but oftentimes sex is one of those ways that human beings connect. So something is going on that is dividing us, right? And so there have been lots of studies trying to figure out why Gen X or Gen Zs and millennials are having less romantic relationships. And loneliness is a big problem. Loneliness has been linked to physical ailments, so linked to cardiovascular disease, repeated heart attacks, autoimmune disorders, high blood pressure, cancer. Even it takes you longer to heal from wounds. And so loneliness is a kind of a big problem, right? And so loneliness has also been linked with a lot of mental health issues in the country. So we actually see rising rates of depression and anxiety and especially those in adolescence. So you can actually see from 6 to 11 on the middle, but by the time that kids are 12 and 17, their rates for depression really shoot up. And then I also wanted to include suicide rates for U.S. adolescents. So that's in the middle is between ages 10 and 14, and suicide for 15-year-olds and 19-year-olds. But what we see so far, the recent studies show that girls are actually committing and so historically girls have always attempted suicides at a greater rate, and boys have completed suicides at a greater rate. Does that make sense? Okay, so now girls are actually, their rate of completion is much higher than it used to be. And data pulled from 35 different countries 35 different studies in 10 different countries actually showed that LGBTQ youth are at particular risk. So LGBTQ youth reported 3 times more likely to attempt suicide than their heteronormative peers. And trans youth are at the highest risk, nearly 6 times more than their peers. And these are some more outcomes of the system that we're living in. Obviously, the reason why Me Too was so successful is because sexual harassment, sexual abuse, sexual assault was astronomical, right? And so it's also clear that certain bodies are targeted. Female bodies, transgender bodies, non-binary bodies are particularly targeted. And so how we are positioned in the world and treated as such impacts our well-being. Okay, so here's the thing. I don't want to leave you on a bad note. We are living in a time of possibilities, like I was saying. So we're living in a time now where we're moving in society and research toward breaking the binary. So your gender identity is basically how you feel inside, how you identify, and how you express those feelings. By clothing, by appearance, and by behaviors can all be expressed, can all express gender identity. But it's kind of exciting because all this means is that you get to simply be a freaking human being. Just be. And nobody care about what that even relates to. That would be really great. So expectations of you based on gender are becoming less rigid. And these conversations are becoming much more common in the mainstream, and they're really openly tackling these issues. And female desire is being prioritized and embraced. So there's a high degree of female sexual assertiveness for sexual desire and pleasure. And it's not to say that more casual sex is necessarily liberating, right? I want to be very careful with how I say this. Casual sex is great. But so what I mean by a high degree of female assertiveness for sexual desire and pleasure is that historically women's pleasure has not been prioritized, right? So as men are, so there was one study in particular where they're asking women, are you sexually satisfied? And most of the women would report, yeah, sure. And that scholar... right under always and above. Yeah, sure. That scholar ended up asking qualitative questions after that. Sarah McClelland in University of Michigan. And she was asking, okay, well, how do you know you're sexually satisfied? Like, what's your marker? And a lot of girls and women in that study would say, well, my male partner, had an orgasm, so I know it was good. What does that leave out? Again, you and I have a connection. I don't even need to say those things. We know what's going on. So it is exciting, right, for women and girls to talk about pleasure and talk about their pleasure and place it in priority. And there's also sexual fluidity. Has anyone heard of that? Yes, got it. Love you. So came mostly from Dr. Lisa Diamond, but it's entering our mainstream conversation more and more. And so it's essentially this idea that a person's attractions, and therefore their sexual identity, whether it's lesbian, gay, bisexual, heterosexual, there's a long list that I don't have time to go through, but there's a lot of different ways you can identify, and that can change over time. And it can change depending on the person that you meet. And how exciting would it be if you met someone that just moved you, instead of having them have to fit a very particular shape and body and color and so on and so forth for you to connect with them, right? So more young people are embracing the notion that human sexuality is dynamic. And it's free and cannot be easily categorized. And so despite accusations that, this is just a phase, we actually see that, this has potential to change everything. All it does is it creates more possibilities. And that's all we're going for. Possibilities to just sort of be more you. And so I want to end this with this whole idea from Bell Hooks. Anyone love Bell Hooks? Yes. So she talks about love ethic. So, the question here now is like, what do we do? Where do we go? And so she basically talks about how love is actually an act. So she doesn't talk about love as the emotional, the romantic aspect of it, but rather it's an act, and that we can openly and honestly express care, affection, responsibility, respect, commitment, and trust for other human beings. And that extending beyond your friends and your family and your lover, right? Extending beyond. And so it could extend to your community and beyond, like your local and your global community. All right. Thank you so much. Do I have time for Q&A? People are like, I want to go. I'm just kidding. Hi.
Oh, there's a microphone and everything. Thank you so much. That was so interesting. So thank you. I would agree with you that this particular time is very interesting in terms of our ability to explore. So there's a series on Netflix called Sexual Education, and I saw it and I thought, man, if I was in high school now, it would be so much better, because I think teenagers have more information. I think it's much harder to be a teenager now than it ever was, but they have much more information. And so they can, like you were saying, feel free to explore more along the spectrum, right? It's not binary.
Yeah.
I mean, so to kind of your point, when I was 8, I had very short hair, and a girl told me, you're not allowed to be in the girls' room because you have short hair. And my very pithy response was, nuh-uh, I have both of my ears are pierced. So, but I have a particular, not issue, but kind of when you had the slide of the women kind of through the ages, I would say we are not doing the same for men. I think very much a lot of our discourse now is about empowering women, which is amazing.
Totally, yeah.
We want women to be strong. We want them to be agile. We want them to be
a step away
fierce.
from that.
But at the same time, then what does that mean? What are the opposites of those terms?
Exactly.
What does it mean when
yes.
you're not strong, you're weak? And then we don't have the equivalent language for boys. And I think Rebecca Tracer's book and the combination of the Me Too movement, I think we have started to think about how to raise women in the current society, but we have not started to think about how to raise boys. And we are not giving them all of the tools that they need to feel comfortable in being emotional, but doesn't mean that you're being weak.
Exactly. And we still continue the binary. If you just flip it and now girls are strong, well then what's weak? And why does caring weak? Why is being human weak? Why is me connecting to another person and having feelings? It's so silly. So literally humans you can't ignore feelings. Feelings, the emotional aspects are a human thing, right? So again, it always positions it back into a binary somewhere. But that's exactly what I was asking, is that for girls and women to be more masculine, is that liberation? If we're saying that masculinity, and so not all forms of masculinity, there are some forms that are really great, right? It's not like maleness is shit, no. But there are particular dimensions in masculinity that we have called toxic masculinity in the mainstream, right? Particular dimensions that we have found are really hurtful and harmful for boys and girls, right? So in my master's research, I was actually looking at girls' adherence to masculinity. And so in that literature, so what we did, can I take this? I feel just so constrained. No. I'm free. No. So in the project that I was working for at NYU, we were tracing, kids in middle school. So from 6th grade, 8th grade, 11th grade, and 12th grade. And this is with Professor Niobe Way at NYU. Love her. So you should read her Deep Secrets book. But we traced them for 4 waves, and for boys, we found a particular pattern. So in 6th grade, you were getting these beautiful, we were listening. There were like 2-hour-long interviews with kids about just everything, right? And 6th grade boys were speaking about their best friends in the sweetest ways. Like, this is my best friend. I love him. I tell him everything. I tell him all of my secrets. And it was just like the sweetest way that you could talk about your best buddy. And then we see by 8th grade, a percentage of that drops off in the same boys that we had heard it say it in the 6th grade. And by 11th grade, a higher percentage drop off. And they start to say things like, when you're going through something rough, who do you tell? Well, I don't tell anybody, right? So there's a shift. And so that's qualitative work. We have lots of quantitative work that has measurements of depression, anxiety, social support. What else did I use? I think those are the 3 major ones that I used in mine. But we have a trend. So this is not our study. This is lots of different studies. So in the 80s, there was a big boom in studying masculinity, right? And so there's tons of research showing that the more masculine ideals that boys and men grab onto and adhere to, the worse off it is for them. So the more that you think you are on your own, you got this, the more you think that you have to be tough and physically tough and emotionally stoic, the more you think you can't show expression, like express your emotions, which is literally it's not human. So the more that you agree with that and do that, the higher your rates of depression, anxiety, and lower social support, which means you have less friends, less close relationships with your family, right? And the thing is, in my master's, I also did the same thing for girls, and we saw the same pattern. So masculinity is not a thing that lives in masculine bodies. It's a set of ideas that we say, you have to go for this. So girls do too. And girls, so there's it gives me an opportunity to talk about the study that I skipped over earlier. So I had this slide. So earlier, there was a group of scholars who looked at pink frilly dresses. And so, oh dear. Okay. So they found that girls at around 3 to 5 years old are vigilant about wearing pink frilly dresses in this study, vigilant. They want to take it off. If their parents ask them to, they're like, no, and they fuss and fight and all of that, right? By the time they get into kindergarten and elementary, you see a huge number of those students flip, and they never want to wear anything pink anymore. Why? You tell me. Why? They go to school. What happens in school?
They see other
They want to see that boys are strong and good and valued.
Thank you. Kids are smart. Kids are super smart. You do subtle stuff and you're I'm being so clever. And you're really not. They're so on point. They're so sharp. So they can pick up when adults treat kids differently. And they notice that boys get more attention. They're looked at as cool. They get to do more fun stuff. So yeah, there's a marked difference in how girls present themselves when they enter elementary and grade school, right? Okay, did I answer any of that? I don't know if I did. I just started talking. Oh, yes.
Thank you. So I know a little bit about dynamic system theory in the context of chaos and chaos theory.
Yeah.
But that's not really attached to social studies and humanities.
Yep.
And you didn't talk about it too much. So can you give me a little bit of context about the work, point me to some papers and books, etc.?
Yes.
Thanks.
So the first paper that I found that really lit me up was by Esther Thelen, who takes DST and applies it to child development. Because again, so I was in developmental psychology. I'm in critical social now. But the idea was that you were asking, kids about how they're growing up. But the thing is that there's tons of things happening. Their parents are there. Who are the parents? How are the teachers? What's the school like? The students and they're hanging out with, the messages that they're seeing outside in the media, in TV shows, all of that stuff. So it's really hard to take account all of those things that are happening. And so Esther Zellin does a beautiful work of taking DST and applying it to child development to show a cascade of interactions and events. Also, Anne Fausto Sterling, if you're interested in this in gender, she applies DST to gender development for babies. Oh, can I tell you about this story? Okay. I get so excited. So, there is this stereotype that girls speak more than boys, yeah? Girls are more talkative than boys. So Anne Fausto Sterling, being a badass researcher, takes newborns and straps recording devices on them. And so, not violent ones. They're like fine. They're not heavy, but but they basically measure who's speaking to the baby and how often at 3 months and 7 months, and it shows that mothers, and I'm sorry, both parents, but particularly. I'm not going to zero. Oh, there's a whole nother thing with mothers. Oh God, I can never just say. Okay. Both parents speak statistically significantly more. God, using like psych language is just so awful. But they speak a lot more to baby girls than they do to baby boys. So particularly, I think the numbers were for mothers, on average in an hour, they spoke to baby girls about 1,263 words per hour. I just looked at this, that's why I know. I am not an encyclopedia. That is not happening here. But mothers spoke to baby boys on average about 463 words per hour. So babies exposed to language. So if you speak to a baby more, they're going to talk more. No shit. Did you see how I said it like quietly? It's like, don't record that. I didn't say that. So we have all of these things in our world that we observe and we notice and we think, oh yeah, then that must be it. But we haven't done the hard work of asking ourselves, well, where did that really start and how did it happen? Right? And that's only one example. That's only one. There are messages like that all over the place in like so many ways. What girls are allowed to wear, how they're allowed to, what their activities are allowed to play. Are teachers calling on girls as much as they are calling on boys? Is there what race like aspects are playing out in that space as well? Ooh, so many. Okay, yes.
I don't want my back to anyone. Hello. So you mentioned how men, if they're more tough, if they're more stern, whether it's a facade or genuine, they end up in a place of vulnerability, but only internal, where they are the only ones to pretty much kind of take care of themselves when they cannot look outward for assistance in certain areas. Yesterday I had on floral pants, and a parent picked me up for my job. I'm not going to say whether it was a mother or father, because we usually kind of shoot to, the father being the one that's more like, or the mom. Forget that, because it is a stereotype. But a parent picked me up from work, and we were going to get my goddaughter, who's my niece, from after school. And they told me, don't worry about it, stay in the car. I'll go get her. Via my pants. And I wanted to say how if a man is totally stoic, they end up in a place of depression, anxiety, whatever else can come from that, which is many things, even suicide. But if they're opposite of being stoic, they still end up in the same place, just through a different outlet. Meanwhile, the goddaughter that we were picking up, she's only 9, and she's personally, I think that she's gonna be not into guys, but she every birthday buy me a new gun. Every conversation is about a Bugatti. She's totally not this. And if she is that, it's because she's just forced to, and she's complaining the whole time that she doesn't want to wear these stockings. And it's a double standard because they would get her the gun, they would get her the rifle, and you know how graphic these toys are nowadays. They're holding no punches. But the double standard is crazy because, you know, if she ends up the way they clearly don't want her to end up, it would be like, well, that's what you created because you didn't fight against it the way you fought against my floral pants.
There's too many weak. I see where you're going, but I feel like there's way there. I just had like 15 notes on the side of your whole thing. Can I address them?
Please do. Can I interact?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so I don't want to come out of here saying that like literally all boys and men are screwed. Not what we're trying to say, right? So one, there are positive aspects of masculinity, but we want to focus on particular ones that are harmful. But so we don't want to conflate gender and sexuality either, though, right? So yes, she may be interested in like guns, which I also in this moment in time right now, and motorcycles or whatever. It doesn't necessarily mean that she's going to have any particular sexual attraction later on, because those are two distinct things. Yeah, we often conflate those, but we need to really be clear that they're not, right? And what was the other thing? Do you have what was your other question?
It wasn't really a question. It was more of an observation through my own living.
Yeah, for sure.
The idea that like if you kind of step outside of the norms, that you end up getting negative feedback from the outside.
Yeah.
Absolutely,
for men,
because we live in a
whether you go
homophobic society.
This way or that way, you end up in the same place, which is detrimental to you, which means you kind of have to stay here instead of going there or there.
That's the complexity of what human beings have to navigate, right? What is safe for me to act out in this very particular moment, right? We navigate that all the time. But I would say that the dangers of both are very distinct from one another, because one case that you are cutting off a piece of your humanity, right? Not being able to share emotions, not being able to tell somebody that you're having a really shitty day and something really awful happened to you and it hurt you. Like it relieves pain when we're able to share that, or when someone hugs us. Touch also relieves pain. That's why we hug kids when they like hurt themselves, right? So there's one way, right? If you stay on that path, it's going to harm you in a very particular way, I think. But the other way, because we live in a homophobic society, at least that person is closer to their truth. Yeah. And so your pain may come from other people's judgment, but like they will be on their process of figuring their shit out. And at some point, realize that everyone is a human being that deserves to just live. And who are we to make the decisions for someone else's existence? Period. Ever. I don't know if that answered any of that, but.
Now, what about for the female side? Comparing how they can go modest, or they can go all of that out, like Kim Kardashian, and it would be just, you would look at it and you would just continue life as normal. It wouldn't be as much of a concern.
Well, what's the question there?
The field is more open for women to have on a great blouse with a mid-calf skirt, or have on a mini with some cleavage.
Yeah. Well, not really, but yes. Like in theory, we accept it, but we really judge and police women's bodies all the time.
Do you think that with women it becomes more ageism, that they judge it based off of age?
No, that's a consistent thing we have in middle school, where girls are policed about what their uniforms look like. So that's a big one. So I think it's across all ages. And we also live in a society that blames girls for the experiences that they have, right? So you experienced assault because you were asking for it. The number of times I have been followed, no matter what I'm wearing. it never matters what you're wearing. It's just that someone else has been told that they are entitled to your body and are pissed that they're not having access to it. Yes.
Oh, wow.
May I give that to her?
Oh, yeah, if it's mine was more of a response, so.
Oh. Okay. Yeah, do you respond?
I was just going to say that in our society it's a very common thing to say, but women are objectified. And so no matter what they wear, they're going to be objectified.
Yep.
And so people like to think that there's like this middle ground that people can have where it's like you can be a woman and you can still be like alluring sexually, but you're not over sexualized and that's bad, but not being like prudish,
Right.
quote unquote prudish, is also negative.
Right.
But I also think that we are socialized, and you kind of touched on this, to think in binaries.
Yeah.
And so we think like that is a man, that is a woman, that is
Right.
good, that is bad. We don't really think in that sort of like, oh, there's like a spectrum and everybody can, even though we like to have conversations like that, we've been socialized to think certain ways. And
Right.
so, we were just
So it's
talking
an
about
active
this.
undoing, yeah.
Exactly. And so when you look at somebody who's wearing a certain thing, it doesn't matter if what they're wearing, how much skin they're showing, how little they're showing. It's going to be an immediate reaction of that is over-sexualized, especially with female bodies,
Right.
is that is over-sexualized
Exactly.
or that is too prudish. And no matter what, it's going to be negative because we look at femininity as negative.
Right.
And the other thing that I wanted to bring up
And not just from men directed to women, but women
directed to women,
Oh,
everyone,
all the time. That's the other point I wanted to make. That women are just as responsible for perpetuating the sexist bullshit in this world that men are.
Yeah.
And men are just as likely to advocate and be allies, right, in breaking down that system.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter the gender of the person involved.
Exactly.
Right? The other thing that you were just saying is that I wanted to speak to is that women's bodies are sexualized oftentimes without their consent.
Mm-hmm.
I'm having a chill ass walk from A to B. I'm trying to literally go to the train. This is not my moment to have a sexual encounter with you.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So bodies are often sexualized without them
Yeah.
being, or without wanting to,
Yeah.
right? Or
Yeah.
consenting to it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and the other point that I wanted to make that I thought was interesting is just just connecting it to capitalism is this idea that time is money, money is time. And if you
Yeah.
want to accumulate capital, you want to monetary capital, then you don't want to waste time. You want to always spend time working, and emotions, especially in
Yeah.
capitalist society, are seen as a waste of time, no matter
Right.
who it is. And so when the trait of being quote unquote emotional is placed on feminine bodies, then that's when a lot of things become negative, because you're seeing it's just a perpetuation of it's all cyclical and everything's connected, and it becomes a whole mess of issues. But I mean,
Yeah.
that's a big part of it. Is that femininity is demonized in a lot of ways, but it's through this capitalist lens of what is worthy and what is not,
Yeah.
and that's where value
It's
comes
profiting
in.
off of your body
Exactly. Yeah.
all the time.
And
Yeah.
specifically related to what you were bringing up about the media and body standards, the more women are encouraged to police themselves, the more time that they spend policing
Yes.
themselves is time that they're diverted from actually looking and examining the systems at
Exactly.
play.
Ooh, you just called out Michel Foucault in that moment. Yes, that's exactly what he talks about. Is that it's much more effective to have you police yourself than to have a police officer or a guard at every door. So if we get you to agree that this is something I shouldn't do and then I will not do it and fall in line, then we're good. Right? Excellent.
That was really interesting.
Hi. I really found your talk fascinating, and I just had a question. I grew up the daughter of a clinical psychiatrist who had many specialties, but one of them was human sexuality. And he did a lot of seminars for very learned doctors and professors, and would teach people even just what is homosexuality in the 60s. And there was a lot of research done and a lot of ongoing intellectual ideas. And I think back, because I grew up with this as a child, with these seminars and lectures, and it was always men teaching men. But now we have more women in the clinical, field, and they've entered the field, and I want to know how much having an integration, not just of different sexes, but different sexualities, how that's affected clinical research and perceptions today as versus, say, in the 70s.
Yeah, so I don't do any clinical work.
Right, but you come.
Yeah,
you're
I actually have a
people
lot of
that-
issues with clinical psychology.
No, I just mean that women are now
Oh, yeah.
a voice. And
Yeah.
different cultures are now a voice. Different sexualities are now a voice. Getting money, teaching people. How has that changed perception?
I think it's changed it tremendously. The thing is, so like research is catching up with the rest of society. So culture moves fast. Culture moves usually first. Then scholars are a piece of it and then try to study it in various ways. We try to either measure it with surveys or we do qualitative work, which then allows for space for discovery. When you talk about that, I think about Carol Gilligan as one of the first, psychologists, women psychologists, who was studying at Harvard at a time when they were, taking data from white males at Harvard and extending that to all human beings as the experience. So I think we are living in a really exciting time where there's way more women in academia. But the thing is that issues about sex, gender, sexuality, and race are still a massive problem in academia. So it is not this fluffy place that is all enlightened. We have all of this research. We know that there's social injustice. We know that we need more diversity, and it happens. It's not the case. So there's still a lot of spaces where women are not getting certain positions. Women are not getting particular, even tenure, or they are not getting like the chair positions. So I think it's still a massive issue, and race in academia is still a massive issue. The vast majority of the professors, like tenured professors in academia, are still white men. And if they are extending out to women, it's mostly white women. So I have been in so many academic spaces where they're like, oh, we really got to bring in diversity here. And it's literally such the biggest bullshit that I've been fed, because it's like, literally, I'm tired of you talking about diversity if you're not going to do it. The last 4 white women ago, we already have this conversation. So the next bunch of times that certain people get hired over others, I'm going to stop thinking that this is a real thing for you. And that's cool. Be honest. That makes my life easier. If people were just more honest about what they think and believe, I think we'd all just like sleep a lot easier, right? But anyway, there's hope. There's hope for the future. Thank you so much for sitting through this.